Hello,
interwebs. Welcome to Philosophising. My name is Ruby.
and I'm
So,
Nathan.
and we are trying a new time slot today because
Yep. Yeah.
we heard more people are awake at this time
Uh-huh.
and are willing to come watch people chat about science.
Which is
So,
it's actually surprising. So I think when we started planning this, we decided to do it like on the weekdays because kind of we assumed that people weren't like watching stuff on Friday nights. Like so traditionally like in network TV, that's like the show that you put show the slot that you put TV shows on when like you hate the writers and want to like kill off the show.
yeah,
Um,
because
but
people go on
actually,
parties and have events on
right.
Friday nights, right?
But
Yeah.
I guess like people no longer do that because I was looking at the Twitch traffic data and it turns out that like the best time to stream is like on the weekends, like weekend afternoons. Um so anyway, yeah, that's why we shifted our time and also just because I guess like it's more convenient for us. But
Yeah, and
yeah,
maybe we'll get to experience some more light daylight hours because on
true.
Fridays we'll
Yeah.
do this, and then we still have some daylight hours left, so we'll see how it goes.
Like honestly, I kind of like this aesthetic for the stream. Like it seems like a little bit less dystopian, which is good because of some of the stuff we talk about.
Oh, instead of like being in a dark
Like
room
yeah,
with
like
a
okay, I
dark
feel
background.
like I feel like when we're sitting in like the Star Wars chair with our dark background, it does seem like a little bit grim versus this seems like lighter and airier.
Yeah, we'll try. Let's see how
Hmm.
the traffic goes for the next couple weeks.
Sounds good.
But
Yeah.
anyway, hello, welcome to Philosophical Sciencing, and today we're going to talk about neurodiversity. I think Nathan suggested this one because April is that
Hmm.
is April
Yeah. So
Neurodiversity
April.
Awareness Month?
Yeah, so it's specifically Autism Acceptance Month, or Autism Awareness Month, and like people will get really mad if you use what they consider the wrong term, which is like the fun thing about like anything related to like neurodiversity is that it makes someone really mad. But actually, I think I prefer the Acceptance Month one, but it is Autism Month. So that's why we were like, oh, let's talk about autism and neurodiversity and all that fun stuff.
Uh,
Um, actually,
Such a
and so
timely topic for
yeah, so I was going to say we have also big news, which is that a couple of days ago, RFK Jr. announced that we're going to find out what causes autism by September. He didn't really say how we're gonna do it. Like, I guess he's just gonna go and like think about it a bunch and then like tell us like what he thought about in September. But yeah, apparently we're gonna find it out. Yay.
like neuroscientists haven't been working on it for
Yeah,
literally a
like
year,
honestly,
like
like I'm just like
hundreds of
I
years.
can just like oh man, like wow, I guess yeah, we really passed up. Like should have gotten on that.
Yeah,
Um
we weren't not studying autism. Like we're
right.
still studying. We do think
Like
it's an
actually
important thing to study.
yeah, like interestingly, so actually the very first place that I did neuroscience research at was at the UC Davis Mind Institute, and that was started like in the 2000s for basically the same reason, which was that a bunch of people are like, huh, there seem to be a lot more cases of autism. We should start to study like why that's happening. And actually they started doing that in like 2001. Um,
Yeah, and it
so
is true that there is more autism, more kids diagnosed with autism now than ever before, right? That it is
mhm.
that trend is genuine. It's like that's a real trend. We are genuinely worried about it. We have some ideas about what causes it, but that's kind of like our thing, right? We throw things at the wall and then things that don't stick. And there's certain things
Mhm.
that we eliminate, and it's definitely not that, definitely not that, definitely not that. And then we're left with like a bunch of things that still could be possible, but like we can only pick things off the wall one at a time. That's just kind of how science works.
Right. Yeah. And I think like I mean it's interesting in the philosophy of science sense. I think like in the 90s and in the 2000s like there really like I think there was a lot more uncertainty and it was a lot like this idea that like okay maybe we're seeing an increase in autism cases because of like mercury poisoning or some sort of toxin or something actually made some sense. Like you would look at it and you'd be like okay, yeah, the symptoms actually do seem similar to what happens when people have these kinds of exposures. Maybe that's what's happening. What we've learned now is that just that was plausible. It wasn't what was happening because the levels of those exposures don't seem to actually correlate with the like being diagnosed with autism or not. And like we've acquired data that has kind of actually ruled out a lot of the mystery. And I guess that is one of the things that I would say to RFK Jr. is that like actually we do know what causes autism. It's genetics. That actually that seems to be very very clear. Um, and like so some statistics that I was looking up. So generally speaking, it's estimated to be about 65 to 90% heritable. And so, kind of like the way that you would think about that is like, okay, if you have an identical twin who has autism, there's between a 65 and a 90% chance that you'll also have it. Um, and if they don't, there's only a like 30 to 10% chance that you'll 10 to 30% chance that you'll or actually
Yeah.
no that's not the other way it works. But if you have it, it's very if they have it it's very likely that you'll have it.
Yeah.
And this has been shown like really repeatedly. Another thing that I was reading about is that so for these cases where like one twin will have it and the other one doesn't, you might be like, okay, what's with this other 20% though? And interestingly, in many of those cases where they don't have it, they'll have some other type of neurodivergent condition. So like the siblings of autistic people are also much more likely to have things like ADHD, borderline personality disorder, interestingly, like eating disorders, really like this whole other kind of mess of stuff. And so the thought is that maybe autism is even more genetic than that statistic would indicate. But it's just kind of like if you have these particular combinations of phenotypes, it gets diagnosed with autism. But if your phenotype is maybe a little bit different, it gets diagnosed as something else, even though kind of it's really biologically largely the same thing.
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of the problem with autism. It's such a broad spread, and like they like basically scientists come together and they make a DSM, like, and they're like, we're gonna define if you hit these criterias, and then they like find ways to quantify it, then you're like you would be autistic on the spectrum, like this much autism. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
and it's like a thing that scientists have to come together every set number of years and like reevaluate the language and reevaluate the actual criteria that they decide to, how are they naming the diseases, and part of it is the language that we use around it. Like, I mean, I don't think it accounts for the entirety of why there's increasing amounts of people diagnosed with autism, but some part of it is how like we're diagnosing more kids now because people are aware of it, and also people are like, oh yeah, that's a funny looking kid, and let's like let's run them through all these tests and see how they're doing, right? Like that's part of the problem. The other problem with it is that it's hard to study because it's very rare to have it's easier to study a disease when it's like in one gene and it's super penetrant. Like those are like
Mhm.
the combo of that makes a really nice disease to study. So for example, my lab studies Rett syndrome, so I can talk about this. So um, like for the longest time, girls that were diagnosed with Rett syndrome were first diagnosed with autism, right? So they'll show the breadth of symptoms that are typically seen in like a 2-year-old child with autism. And then like only once we start doing genetic screens for things that we know of, um, that could cause these symptoms, then we know that, oh yeah, these kids that were diagnosed with autism, actually they have Rett syndrome. And then like the reason they have all these phenotypes is because now they express a mutant form of MACP2, and
Mhm.
like then we can be like, okay, the transcriptional changes, like that's why. But the majority of kids that are diagnosed with autism, they'll run through these genetic panels and don't hit any of these monogenic, highly penetrant diseases. So, or highly penetrant uh, uh, like
Genes.
changes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
then we're like, what? So it's like a bunch of different genes doing like partially different things, and that probably is true. Um, but we don't like it's hard to study the things like and there's things we can do right they'll do
Right.
things like GWAS studies which look at like smaller changes in large huge populations of people and then be like hey what are things that stick out
Mhm.
and we're going to talk about like some of the things that we're like like neurodivergence like where is normal like what is the normal
Mhm.
neurotypical like activity and like it's easy to study if you get like for example like a bi what's it called bimodal distribution like it's like here is the normal people here is the not normal people the problem is like it's probably more like one big Gaussian curve and you're just going at the tail end and being like all right these kids out here they're autistic and if you
Uh-huh.
do something like that it's very easy to see that if it's like a gradual change or there's like not like you'll see people in the middle with similar genetic profiles that are with similar kinds of copy number variants similar, you know what I mean without the
Mhm.
phenotypes and then you're like well then that's not it right so maybe it's when it's like a lot of little changes everywhere that could cause it
Yeah.
and then there's
I
also
mean,
that's just genetics right there's also the environmental factors right we've talked about how like the environment that people grow up in can really influence like their experience of the world right
yeah. Although, like those heredity studies that were trying to influence or measure the genetic contributions, oftentimes they also look at basically they can mathematically calculate, like, okay, how much is due to being raised in the same childhood environment? What they find generally is that that has a very small impact on developing autism, which I think is also relevant to this RFK Jr. stuff, and it kind of matches the epidemiology, which is like there's a few environmental things like maybe early life infections, maybe parental age that it might be linked to autism, but they seem to be very, very small effects compared to the genetics.
yeah
um, I think I also I think what you were saying about what you were saying about the diagnosis is really interesting because it also kind of gets into the question of like, okay, why, like, why do you diagnose people in the first place too? And I think and I think interestingly, like the reason is usually because it's like you want to do something useful. And I think it's really interesting because there's been this conversation for the last decade about like, okay, are we diagnosing autism the way that we should, and it's like we were underdiagnosing it in the past, or are we overdiagnosing it now and we were doing it a better job at the past, and maybe some of these people who like are being diagnosed with autism now should have actually been diagnosed with like intellectual disability or speech impediment or something different.
yeah
And
this
honestly, I
is my
guess
favorite one of my favorite stumps is that like western medicine is getting like um what's that called like traded it's getting
it's getting.
spread yeah
Mhm.
like one of the examples for this is like the best example I read this book a couple years ago called oh man I wrote it down
Is it
it was
crazy like us?
yeah, Crazy Like Us. And I was like, wait, what? Like people in certain cultures that have completely different medical systems and like don't have psychologists and grief counselors and things like that, they survive horrific traumatic events like horrible earthquakes and all that stuff and then the Red Cross would like show up with like their grief counselors and then they're like who are you
And they're
what's
like,
your
what
job
do we do with this?
yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, what do we do with the grief counselors? And they're like, nah, like we have community. Like we have like, we have a system for like grieving and we take care of our community on our own. Like we got this. Like we don't need we don't need you. Like it's important to like keep track of the anthropomorph like what we're doing. Like when we're like transporting our like medicine and science to the people. Like I think that's one example where it wasn't super sensitively done. Um, and it's also important that you know how like what is that physics thing where if you like look at the cat, you know it's dead or not, and it's in a box.
Schrodinger's cat.
Yeah, Schrodinger's cat. I feel like this is one of those issues. Like, if you tell a kid, "Hey, you are a trouble kid," like, okay, not I'm not even saying autism. I'm just saying
Mhm.
you child are a, um, you're just like a rebellious child. Like, if you tell this
Mhm.
child you are such a rebel, like that kid is going to go either. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, like they're gonna internalize that
yeah, they'll
in
internalize
some
it. It's like
sense.
I'm a rebel, and I
Yeah.
think I grew up as a girl in the US, and, like,
Mhm.
there was I don't think anyone ever told me that, but, like, you could embody the, like, boys are better at math than girls," and, like, do you know what I mean? Like, I
Mhm.
might like, I don't think I actively was trying not to internalize, but I think it still is in the zeitgeist, like, you and
Yeah.
it
Mhm.
influences them. They're like, "Oh, like, if
Yeah.
there's not good
I
role
guess like
models, it's easy to, like, send these kids on a self-fulfilling prophecy."
I guess like what I was gonna say about diagnosis is I think kind of so you get these interesting questions. It's like, okay, is it an overdiagnosis or an underdiagnosis thing? And I think like the interesting thing is like, okay, this it really even only makes sense in the context of like what do you want to do? I mean, like it's like it is like you have to be talking about a specific goal. And I think that's the part that's really hard to that's hard to define. I think one of the problems I have with some of the attitudes in some of these books like Crazy Like Us is that kind of they um they like sort of the implicit attitude when people talk about like overdiagnosis of autism and other things is that kind of that these kids would be fine if you left them alone, and I'm not convinced that's true because when you look at like samples of these kids, I mean what you see is actually they have like extremely high rates of like trauma and suffering from abuse. And so clearly and often short, like much shorter than normal life expectancies. And like this is not a population of people who is like would be doing well if you just left them alone. On the other hand, I mean, when you talk to people, some of like with autistic people, some of the most traumatic things that you talk to that people will tell you about are actually like attempts to treat them and like experiences they have in like the special education system. And so like that does kind of argue for the case that like maybe we shouldn't be doing this, but it's really hard to say what would be better, I guess.
Yeah, I do think, like, quantifying profound autism that requires, like, a lot of support.
Mhm,
I think that's really important, and actually we have
mhm.
done that, right? Scientists have done that, and even profound autism has, like, doubled in the past, like, 30 years. That's crazy.
Yeah.
So
And
that's
a
still a
big
thing, right?
Right. And a big part of that is probably because of substitution of other things. Sorry, this light keeps turning off. So at the same time kind of that profound autism has doubled, um, like the rates of just kind of general intellectual disability and kind of specific speech problems have dropped in half. So it seems like basically people are being diagnosed with autism instead of these other things. And interestingly, like that seems to, like we're talking about the goals. I think one of the goals is actually there's a lot of autism specific services. So it kind of makes sense to classify people
Yeah.
as having autism.
Yeah, I understand as a society, it's probably necessary to classify people, and then also, like, here are the things, like, schools, and, like, here's the support needs, like, all those
Mhm.
kinds of things could not happen without, like, a definition, right? So,
Yeah.
like,
I mean,
yeah.
interestingly, I feel like they could happen without a definition. And I think I mean, this is kind of like in the disability movements, there's this concept of universal design, which is just kind of like that you try and make things accessible to everyone inherently by design. And honestly, I think a lot of these problems are avoidable. Like I think the way that kind of school-based programs work is very stupid in that you have to be given this diagnosis and then like meet specific criteria for having one of this like list of conditions. And then if you have that, then you work with the teachers to figure out individualized accommodations for that person, which like most of the time have nothing to do with like the actual diagnosis. It's just stuff that the person needs. I'm just like, why, like if a student is just like, wow, it's really hard for me to pay attention in this class, the response should just be like, okay, sure, you can take the test somewhere else. Like,
Yeah, you're like, why don't we know how to fix it? Like, why must we
right.
first get
It's
the
like,
diagnosis and then the paper slip and then like all
it
the red
is,
tape, right?
yeah, it is. It's kind of darkly ironic that to get this thing called an individualized education plan, which is the thing like that we use for these services in the US, like you have to go through this extremely standardized, non-individualized process where they basically put you in this box, and then they completely ignore it because everyone realizes that kind of the clinical classification is actually entirely useless for talking about an individual person's needs.
I was gonna say, I think the answer is money, because some insurance company needs to be able to put it under a line for why we
Yeah,
spent this
yeah,
extra money on this child.
definitely money, and then just legal requirements. I
Yeah.
mean, it also has to do with the fact that this is all linked to the Americans with Disabilities Act and kind of that was really developed to deal with things that are more like mobility and visual impairments, where it's like it is more concrete. It's like how many eyes do you have,
It's
and
like, is there a
that
ramp?
yeah, like that model doesn't work very well for neurodiversity, I think. And like honestly, I mean, like and like I educate people. I honestly think the model should be that we ask people what they need and then we accommodate that. Like,
That's
uh,
true. They have the people that have it and the families that have these diseases know what they need, right? They can be like, "Hey,
yeah,
we need, a night nurse, or we need, ramps, or we need like whatever." Like they know best because they're the ones trying to navigate the world. Like it should be a bottom up kind of like listen to them and then help them get their goals done.
exactly. Yeah. And I
Yeah,
think
that would be
like,
a
I mean,
nice.
we're talking about like, are these categories useful? And I think like, I mean, I think if we had a system that was more like that, it would be useful.
Yeah, the other place I think it could be useful as a scientist is so that we can just make groups. Like so we could be like
uh
control groups versus profound versus mild. Like it's
Yeah,
helpful for us to be able to test things and see if there's trends. That's like the only other place where I'd be like, yeah. But when we do that, we screen them most patients ourselves and be like, hey, they need to hit this criteria, they need to be this age, they need to have like lived this long here, and they need to have language proficiency. Like, do you know what I mean? Like we'll
mhm.
make our own criteria for, and they're usually even more strict than these. So these are just like they're simultaneously too strict and like not strict enough for the purposes of science. So
Mhm. Yeah. And I do think, like, I think that's like, so we were also talking about like the genetics of autism, and kind of you were talking about how it's not the case that like there's a couple of genes that are really strongly linked to autism, or rather it is that there is a couple of genes that are really so we know that like autism is almost entirely a genetic thing, but it's not like, okay, you have one gene that causes like most of the cases of autism. It seems like it's really, there's a few genes where like if you have a mutation in them, you're very likely to have autism, but those genes are also very rare. And the majority of autistic people actually, they probably have like a few dozen to 100 mutations in other genes. And these same mutations also occur in a lot of other types of neurodivergence, and occasionally also neurotypical people.
yeah.
And I think it's so one of the really interesting things I was reading was talking about kind of an evolutionary perspective on this. And I think one of the things that they were pointing out is that a lot of these genes that are linked to autism are also they're they're in genes that actually like acquired are there in genes that kind of like underwent evolution very recently in humans. So they seem to be genes that kind of we have that do certain functions in us, not like in other animals. And one of the thoughts is that maybe these autism and maybe some of these other conditions are actually kind of byproducts of us having evolving to have like larger brains and language abilities and that sort of thing.
Oh.
And
Oh,
so
you
there's
think
this.
this is the future generation of us will just all have
So it's
more of
not
these traits?
clear.
Yeah, possibly.
This is actually a study that I was thinking about, like that would be cool to do, and I couldn't see that anyone has done it, but it would be interesting, like if you had a population like genetic survey from like 2000 and one from now, if you actually look at the prevalence of autism related alleles, because that kind of gets around the like diagnostic like changes in diagnostic criteria thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I wonder if it's just like drifting because there's like more equal opportunity like breeding and birthing.
yeah, I
Those,
mean, so that.
right? Like it's no longer just like survival of the fittest like physically. Now it's like survival of the whoever wants to have kids, and they tend to be older people or people that are highly intellectual. Do you know what I mean? Like, and then like intellectual people like other intellectual people, and so they have kids, and maybe there's just more autistic kids because those are the people who are breeding. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it would be weird, like it would be weird for that to happen so fast if we were talking about like a like kind of a typical natural selection thing. Like that because it's really we're talking about just like a couple of generations and like this massive increase. But one thing that I have seen
Could have been
talked about.
happening this whole time, and it was just like because like I think this is a gradient. Like I genuinely
Mhm.
believe these like it's a gradient. Like I think we've just been on this like slope for this whole time, and it's just shifted and shifted and shifted slowly, and we
Mhm.
haven't really like noticed it. We wouldn't have noticed it as much if we weren't like counting.
That's true. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
Like
guess like I think that's true. I don't think that explains like the rapid rise in autism over the like last 20 years, but I think like it might I think it like so when you read about this like it seems like people like these genes seem to be relatively common, and I think one of the theories about that is because they actually did confer a survival advantage for us. And in fact, you can do like so there's genomics analyses where you can look at basically the rate of mutations that occur around a gene of interest, and you can kind of computationally figure out if that gene is being positively selected for. And interestingly, like what we know about is that a lot of these genes that are associated with autism risk have undergone pretty intense positive selection. So it seems like they seem to have conferred some survival benefits or reproductive benefits for us in the last few tens of thousands of years,
yeah,
which I think is pretty interesting.
yeah. I mean, but this also like highlights the importance of literally diversity, right? Because we
Mhm.
need a breadth of strategies to survive.
Yeah, yeah,
So the more kinds of people out there, the more likely as a species we will to survive.
yeah,
Whatever new environment, next time like, horrible like a comet comes and like punches us in the gut. Who knows? Like we
right.
just kind of have to be lucky.
Mm.
And that's the argument for diversity in general, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah, like
The
you need to
diversity of
have.
people, diversity of ideas, like it's better to have more eggs in more baskets so that we can like more likely survive.
I
Uh
just put the paper in the chat too.
okay.
I also think so. Another way of thinking about like diversity and like I was also thinking about like the parallel with biodiversity. So like oftentimes we'll go into the forest and we'll just like look for plants that like produce interesting toxins because oftentimes they tend to be really useful for like killing cancer cells or killing bacteria or something like that. And honestly, I think there's similar things going on in the brain. Like when you look at people who have these, and I think this is something that's really understudied, is like looking at neural like kind of brain function in people who have atypical brains and what can we learn that we can use to kind of help make everyone better. I think one interestingly this is also in the context of autism. um, there is some evidence that autistic people seem to have be kind of resistant to Alzheimer's and dementia. And the hypothesis is that it's because we start off with like a higher kind of baseline neuroplasticity, which provides a buffer against it.
Oh,
Um,
so nice.
and I think I don't know, I just think it's like, I wish we did more of that kind of research, like in autism and other conditions, because I think there's this bias towards thinking of these things that as diseases that kind of is limiting, it kind of biases against thinking about like this in a biodiversity way, like kind of like what can we gain from studying this, that the tools that we might be able to use to improve health.
Oh, what a good segue to my portion of the research. So I actually decided to study to prepare for this week synesthesia, which is really it's significantly more prevalent in autistic people than in a neurotypical cohorts. And so I think like 30% more. And actually I have a graph. So Simon Baron Cohen has this paper where he looked at a bunch of adults that were diagnosed with autism, like clinically diagnosed with autism, and a bunch of adults age matched all that controls, and they found 18.9% were also synesthetes, and where there was like only 7% were, no, sorry, the other way around. Of these, they had a cohort of people that were all synesthetes, and of those synesthetes, 18% of them had autism, and 7.2% of them were neurotypical. But wait, let me first talk about why I really thought synesthesia would be a really nice topic. The first thought was this is not neuropathological. Like, it's generally agreed, and like the general consensus is that it's like not harmful. And it's
Although some people who have it do find it harmful, right?
no, so then it would be called something else, right? So like if
Oh,
it's, yeah, it actually is like synesthesia is actually well, okay, so it's like generally socially desirable because it's like different, but it's like almost like a superpower. But so the idea is if we're calling it if we like really break it down, it's like there's an inducer, which is like the sensory stimulus, and then there's a co-current pairing, which is like a pairing of a separate perception that is in addition to the actual sense that you're getting. When it's in pairing, for example, if you get illusions, that's when you get an inducer, but then it gets misperceived. Or a hallucination is when you get a co-current pairing with no inducer. So synesthesia is just like you get inducer. So usually you get inducer and you get a normal response, or like normal perception. Synesthesia is when you get an inducer and then you get that normal response in addition to a like pairing of a different sensory stimuli. And so this would be like if you just listen to like a note and this, like listen to like music, and then there's like colors coming out, like certain notes would be like orange or yellow or green or something like that. That's like usually like the general consensus of what synesthesia is. And the other half of it is that it needs to be internally consistent. So for these people who experience it, basically, if I heard the note B flat today and it's orange, tomorrow when they hear B flat, it'll also be orange. And like 3 years from now, if they heard B flat, it'll always still be orange. Whereas in like the general public, the neurotypical people, it wouldn't it would be like orange or red or whatever color randomly. You just kind of pick
like it wouldn't be consistent.
yeah,
Yeah.
so that's actually how you test for true like true synesthetes from people who are just like very artistic and like to pair things. And like
That makes sense. Yeah.
yeah. And so I have some numbers. So oh, actually, it's also kind of hard to study because originally, well, actually, like one of the best studies before the 2000s was basically they just put a newspaper article out. This is the Cambridge study where they were like, "Tell us if you're synesthete. We want to study you. come, come to Cambridge." And they just like put an advert in the newspaper, and basically there was like a 5-to-1 ratio of like women to men, and then they're like, "Okay, more women, or there's more synesthesia in women," or and then they got a percentage. So back then, where are my numbers? Uh, So I wanted to know how rare it was, like the prevalence.
Mhm.
And they said, uh, woo, where are my numbers? Okay, yeah. So from that study, they said it was a 1 in 2,000, and there was a 5-to-1 ratio of women to men, like in self-report. And since then, we've done like more studies, and so more recent studies would screen instead of asking people to self-report, which biases people that will read the newspaper, respond to a newspaper about,
Right.
and have like the time to go to a university to get evaluated. Um, Instead, they're screening like a broad population. So, like, let's say you take 20,000 people from on random, like all different ages,
And so you
sexes.
can do this kind of association consistency test on them,
Correct.
and
Yeah,
then
yeah. And
just
then
yeah.
they follow it up by these like consistency tests on them. And then we ask them like self-report and stuff. From that kind of study, it turns out to be about 4.4% for like 140 types of non-spatial synesthesia. So these are just like letters and colors or smell and taste, like those kinds of combos. And but then if you add spatial ones, which is like numbers and like direction and like orientation, it's kind of like on a
Mhm.
clock or something, like 3 is on the right, like that kind of association, then it's like 10 more percent. So then we're in like the 10 to 20% of people do this. And then I was looking at these numbers and I'm like, these are really high numbers. You're telling me 10 to 20% people have some form of spatial synesthesia, and plus the 4% that are like really, really at synesthesia. Like that's a lot of people with, and I was like, is it even
Like
atypical?
you said, even abnormal.
Yeah, I was like, is this even
Yeah.
atypical of a behavior anymore? Um, which is kind of cool. So I actually plotted some. Can you do the shared screen thing?
Yeah, yeah. But what do you want me to share?
Oh yeah, just share this. Oh, actually, we can share the color screen, like the one with the exact match with the color swatches. I think it's on this slide three of seven, or page 3 of 7. I think it's kind of nice. So they basically use this
Oh,
like
yeah.
color swatch. And so, depending on what kind of synesthete you are, they'll play you, like, let's say you're an auditory to color synesthete, like, for example, and they will just have like a CD with like a bunch of different pitches, and they'll just randomize them, and then you just like, okay, so like you'll listen to the sound, and then you basically go into the color swatches and pick a color, like pick gray or green or whatever, and then you come back like 2 weeks from now, you do it again, and they
Mhm.
randomize the pitch, and you just keep giving you different pitches, and then you just pick color swatches. And so they're challenged to try and be as accurate as possible. So even the controls, like if I went in, I as a non-synesthete will go in and be like, that sound at B flat is a green. Like I'm gonna go for green next time. And so we're gonna see how accurate I get to green next time I hear the sound. um and they'll find percentages like way higher in the true synesthetes. Like, let's see, I think I put numbers here. They'll have uh oh, and if we also add like 1 or 2% of the people who have like personalities for colors or letters, they'll be like, oh,
Mhm.
Wednesday is a happy, or Thursday is shy. um it adds up to like over 20% of
Yeah.
the general population. Okay,
It's
so
interesting.
yeah,
It's
here, so if
interesting
you
that
look at figure 1, if you scroll down to figure 1, oh yeah, yeah, down. Oh yeah, the bottom one. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So if you look at this one, this is how people do on the consistency score across time. So it's
Mhm.
like this curve. And basically like you just draw this dotted line here, and then everyone to the right of that. Like those be your synesthetes.
Yeah. I mean, but do the people who are kind of these known synesthetes, do they have other subjective experiences that are more starkly different from the non-synesthetes? Because like I feel like when I hear people talk about like the stereotypical experiences of synesthesia, it's like you see illusory colors on things that aren't actually colored. And like I don't think that like non-synesthetes do that a little bit.
Yeah,
Like,
maybe.
yeah.
It's a problem is like you kind of have to group them, right? So if you go up
Yeah.
to figure 2, which is just the figure above it,
Mhm.
so this figure shows you by questionnaire who who were the synesthetes.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more like self-identified
Right.
synesthetes than there
I
are
guess
like
I
true
guess my question is
consistent, right?
like synesthesia, like when we think about what synesthesia is, it isn't just, is it like maybe this being highly consistent is very specific for synesthesia, but it's not the entirety of what synesthesia is. And like I'm just thinking it seems actually like the fact that they're highly specific is because they're actually having a very different, subjectively different perceptual experience. And maybe that seems like the part that is maybe not so shared with the general population, even though the general population maybe can sometimes get high consistency too.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think,
Yeah.
a good example of this is kind of like musicians that or artists that like perceive colors really acutely, right? Because like they're very good at it. And like they spend a lot of time like studying and being good at their craft. Um,
Mhm.
like they could score really high on this
Right.
because they're like, yeah, that's cerulean blue number 2 or whatever. and,
Mhm.
and like we'll match it with it. Like they could be much better at it. Like you could study for this test and get really good scores.
Right. Yeah, just if you have like a thing that requires a lot of
Yeah, yeah.
perceptual
Yeah, but
discrimination.
I
Yeah.
think like one of the other parts of synesthesia is that it's like not voluntary.
Right.
It's more like you hear this name and it smells like orange. Like they can't really like it's like it's almost automatic.
It's not like you're like, oh, like I can think about what this reminds me of, and it's always oranges. It's just this kind of like automatic
Yeah.
mapping.
Yeah, and it's actually kind of cool because like there's very close similarities of people who have like aphantasia and people who have like there's overlaps with people that are that don't have ability like have different kinds of neurodiversity.
Right.
Um yeah, like it's just it's such a fascinating like way to see or like to know that other people use their brains differently. Like they're
Yeah.
navigating the same world, but they experience it differently. Like I was reading some accounts and like this kid was like, wait, they don't dim the lights at the beginning of the or like they go to see a symphony orchestra and they like dim the lights, the house lights, and then like you guys
Mhm.
don't turn the lights off so that the music dances in the sky better. And then we're all like, no,
And you're like,
just
no,
use better.
no,
Like I
that's
mean, like
not
what a
why.
lovely way to like experience the world, right? Um, I thought that was really cool. Okay, so that's how people study it, but I wanted to actually bring up the brain differences, which is kind of cool. So with
Mhm.
these categorically, like with this kind of like consistency score, you can actually like define, like quantify who are synesthetes. Using this method, that are super consistent with like their associations, and then you can
Mhm.
just like stick them in MRIs, or like you can stick them in an fMRI. You can make them do scans, and they can like see what the difference was between their brains and regular control brains look like. And they found actually higher connections in increased structural connectivity, and so specifically like more coherent like white matter in like
Hmm.
areas like the frontal parietal areas. And one of the hypotheses for why this is so is that maybe they're like, so like these are areas where like we're binding sensory information, right? Like how are like different kinds of modalities being bound. One of the hypotheses is that it's happening in the parietal cortex or in the parietal areas, and like it's overbound. It's like you're binding more than just like the letter like in the meaning. Like the letter A means like first letter alphabet, this is how it's used. Or the word orange means orange, the fruit and the color. Like it's binding more than that. It's now in addition to being a orange being a color and a fruit, it also is bound to like a sound. And so now
Are
you like
these
hear a noise, right?
Yeah, how long, how long range are these strengthened connections? Like, are these like connections between like the frontal cortex executive function areas and the visual cortex, or are these like connections between like two different visual processing areas?
It's hard to tell. So if you look at this paper, there's a paper I put in after the bolded structural in connectivity. It's a Nature paper by Schultz.
Oh,
Schultz.
yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, you can see in figure 1. It's actually hard to tell if you like don't know what you're looking for, which I did have no idea what I'm looking for. um, in figure 1, yeah, if you scroll down, actually figure 2. Yeah, here's like
That's
inferior
fine.
temporal
Yeah.
cortex. Yeah, and so they're like showing the differences between their controls and like a bunch of controls and a bunch of let's see how many there actually are to tell you the actual numbers. Of course they don't tell you the actual numbers. Where is the figure full size image? Figure legends. Ah. Now they're just showing you
Oh,
comparisons
yeah.
between their controls and their synesthetes, and they're like, oh hey, look at this area and the temporal.
So okay, that kind of answers my question though, because like that, like so it's only this yellow blob here, which is where they're finding increased white matter. So it really is this very local spot.
Yeah, it's yeah, and it's like really consistent, right? Like if you even go further down, like figure 3, like they're plotting individuals right here, right?
Mhm.
Like on the left is your controls and on the
Oh
right
yeah,
your synesthetes. Like
FA right temporal. Yeah.
yeah, it's like it's quite convincing that their brains are literally there's literally something different in how they
Mhm.
are literally wired, right? Like this is
Yeah.
diffusion tensor imaging, so this is just like how much like, um connections there are, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. And it makes sense to me. Like that pattern makes sense to me because it's like, okay, it's just this spot in the right temporal lobe. Like this kind of like that's an area that's storing a lot of just like high level representations of different visual objects. So you could like imagine like what this means is like that, for example, like that the parts that recognize letters are just more wired to the parts that recognize colors, for example. Like that seems consistent with what they
Yeah.
found.
And I think I didn't put the paper down, but I think there's some evidence where they have them in fMRIs and they like show them like
Mhm.
black letters and numbers, and in controls you'll just see like black letters and numbers and wherever it normally gets. So you get that in the synesthetes as well, but in addition to that they'll get like colors or olfactory whatever. Like if they smell the number 2 as orange smelling, like they'll smell it. Like those parts of their um like there'll be increased blood flow in those areas as well. So
That's
like
neat.
it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's clearly linked for them, right? Like it's a real perception. There is a real like biological like mechanism for why it's happening. Um yeah, it's cool.
Mhm.
And the other thing is that like autism, it's also really hereditary, but interestingly not in the same way. So like for example, like a father and son would both like are more likely to have if the father was a synesthete, their son would be more likely to be synesthete, but the father could have like color number synesthesia, and then the son could have like letters and auditory synesthesia.
Yeah.
Like it's the predisposition of being a synesthete being passed down, but not the actual like modality, like letters and colors or smells and whatever. It's interesting. Like some families, like every family member would have different kinds of synesthesia, like, but it would be like
Yeah.
the whole family would have it. So
Which
that
kind of makes sense. Like if we're thinking about this like neural connectivity of hypothesis of synesthesia, maybe like kind of the underlying thing is just kind of you have more tendency for these brain circuits that are representing different things to get cross-wired. And then that is just kind of a thing that can happen anywhere in the brain, maybe depending on what experiences you have, and then that determines the kind of synesthesia you have.
Yeah, yeah. And like more recently, the Max Planck has been doing these like wide genome studies with like a lot of people, like hundreds of people, to figure out if you could, see differences in their genetics that could like make you have this predisposition. Because clearly it's familial,
Mhm.
right? It's not just sporadic.
Yeah.
Um, and the one of the things that really popped out was actually autism. It's like
Hmm.
much more prevalent. In
I'm
in
curious.
yeah
In autistic people, yeah.
yeah
Do we still see, so do we still, this like sex ratio in synesthesia, is that still thought to be a thing, or is it thought that was just entirely an artifact?
Yeah, it's actually an artifact. So like from these large
Yeah.
studies where it's completely random, when we do the recruiting, instead of like self-reporting, it's
Mhm.
actually evenly split between females and males, and it's mostly, I guess, like females were like, "Oh, that's strange. I have that." They were the ones reporting it. And
They
so
were
in
the
these
ones who were
earlier
like reading
studies,
this newspaper ad. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So specifically, so in the study with like all the random humans, the percentage of people with synesthesia that have autism is around like somewhere between like a little bit less than 20%. And then for controls, these are people that just have don't have autism and do have synesthesia. That's around 5%. This is the big large study from Max Planck.
Wow. Yeah.
So that's quite a difference, right? That's like almost threefold difference. I have
Yeah.
like a sad bar graph somewhere. It's okay. I don't think
Let's see if
people
I
need to
can
see it.
find it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like on the last
Oh yeah,
page.
it's down here. It looks a little bit fake, but
Doesn't it? I put the table underneath it because it felt fake. I was just like, whoa, that's really high. So okay,
yeah.
the ends here are for the autism group, there was 164 autistic people and 97 typical. Um,
Uh-huh.
and yeah, so
Yeah.
that's
Oh
the
yeah,
difference.
there's the chart. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's basically 7 people versus 31 people.
Yeah. And that's super interesting actually, because like I mean, so we were talking about this kind of this idea of like altered connectivity and altered white matter in synesthesia. And for anyone who's not familiar, so white matter is basically the fiber tracks that are carrying information between different parts of the brain. And interestingly, like this has also been talked about a lot in the context of autism. So one of the theories about like what is going on neurologically in autism is that there's alterations the in the how brain networks are connected to each other. And I think actually there's been quite a bit of conflicting research on it, and some studies have shown kind of have said like, okay, we actually have more connections. Others have said we have less connections. I think the consensus that has emerged is that the autistic people tend to have more short range connections and less long range connections, although it's still a little bit like tenuous.
Yeah.
Um, but it's really interesting, like if you can see kind of maybe that manifesting and that we're more likely to also have synesthesia.
Yeah. And it's hard sometimes it's hard to study like, hey, does it cause you to be better at something? Because
Mhm.
there's like a chicken and egg problem, right? So like creative people tend more creative people have synesthesia, but do they is it just because they are gravitating towards those careers because they experience,
Because they were able to
like
have
yeah,
this.
like
Yeah.
more musicians have music color synesthesia. And I'm like, well, maybe it's just because like they like, they grew up being seeing colors and they're like, oh, this is amazing. Like I'm gonna spend more time doing that. And they got really good at music. And so they became like, like it's like a what came
Yeah.
first,
I
right?
mean, when you come back to your consistency test, it seems like you have this different perceptual experience, and therefore you can be very consistent, and like that potentially could be advantageous for like memory and learning in the domain that you're trying to learn.
Oh yeah, for sure. I can totally see like having music color synesthesia be super useful when you're like who like listening to like a group of violinists and like picking out the one violinist that's flat because
Yeah.
like their color would literally be different.
It's like, nope, you're pink. Stop doing
Yeah, yeah. You're like, hey, you're
that.
flat, like, tighten up, your A string or whatever. I could
Man,
totally see that being useful, right?
imagine if like the conductor didn't realize that like other people didn't see the world like that, and they're just like, "Hey, you're playing really orange." Stop.
Yeah, no, I think Feynman, Feynman had synesthesia, and his like equations that he would write on the blackboard for his students would be in color for him, and it wouldn't be in color for any of his students. Yeah, there's like a lot of famous people with synesthesia, like Marilyn Monroe, Van Gogh, Sibelius was a famous composer. Um, oh, the other cool thing is that this like so they could also do like a creativity score. they did this with these populations because they're like, we're studying them, let's ask them other questions. And turns out creativity scores also correlate really well with people with synesthesia, like really high correlation between them. And creativity scores are like these tests where they ask, connect these 3 random words, and it'll be like,
Mhm.
boot and um that's a hard word. Actually, let me think of a different word. Uh oh yeah, actually that's okay. Boot and rain and something like that. Like make a connection, and
Mhm.
then like kids will be like, oh, like, camp, boot camp, or
Uh-huh.
whatever. Like ring, like they'll just make connections. Like they'll just create really nice like maps and connections or however they do. They're just really good at it, and they score really high on these scores. And these kids that score really high on these, um you can find them, you can like separate out your kids like before they're 10. Like they were studying kids between age 5 and 10, and they could like find these hyper creative kids like already, and within that population you have significantly more synesthetes than you have non-synesthetes, right? Like it's super like
Really, yeah.
you can
Mhm.
see how it could be useful, right? Like it's useful for like creativity. It's also overlaps with a little bit of anxiety. like
Yeah.
like
I
they'll
mean,
they'll be more likely synesthetes, but also more likely have um like social anxiety as children. Like it's not all of it, right? Like it's just like in that group there's a higher prevalence of it.
yeah. And I wonder if it's because like they have higher creativity because they see things differently, or I wonder if this higher creativity is just because they have a different brain structure.
Yeah, or they're
Like,
like
um,
hyper
like
focused
you could
on something really
or just
better.
like I mean, like you think about like a lot of creativity is just about association, right? Like having a
Yeah.
thing prime another thing. So maybe just if you physiologic or if you anatomically have more interlinked brain systems, maybe it's just easier for you to do that task, kind of independent of like how you're actually perceiving the world.
Yeah, at some point I was like sat there and I was thinking like,
Mhm.
is it just these people who've decided to use this particular memory strategy like when they were a child, and then just stuck with it, and like that was the strategy. They'll just like, we'll just assign an extra like thing sense to it, and then like it's less energy. And it's um like wired directly. Do you know what I mean? It's just like hardwired an extra wire, and then it just makes life simpler for them.
I do know some people have tried to like induce, like train themselves to have synesthesia, and it never really seemed to work. So I
Yeah,
think there does have to be some innate, like
yeah,
neurological thing you have to have.
like a predisposition to it.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's true. Like that being said, you can train, like you might not be, musically gifted where you have perfect pitch and you can see colors in the sounds, but you could train and get very close and you can at least
True.
learn to be a
Yeah.
really good relative pitcher. Like you can memorize one pitch and then just be like, how far is it from this pitch? And like we can learn it, right? Like a lot of these things are
Are
um
learnable.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
like an
Yeah.
edge. Like you get an edge occasionally.
But it's
um,
also, I mean, it also might be that you can learn it, but you're doing it in a completely different way from someone who had this different brain structure too.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I
Um,
think one thing I wanted to just mention is like also like just with some of the autism stuff, I think one of the things I was trying to look into is I was like, okay, so what are like the kind of the anatomical or physiological like things that make autism what it is? And it's kind of interesting because it's like it seems like there's all these different genes that can give you autism, but they must all kind of converge on some phenotype somehow. And it turns out it's really pretty crazy and messy. And it's like there's various studies showing like, okay, autistic people maybe it's very messy. It's like, okay, they find reliably like higher cell counts in some areas of the brain and like lower cell counts in other areas of the brain. It's very hard to make sense of most of it, but like there are some things that seem to be like more consistent. One is that like autistic people seem to generally have higher neural excitability, like a higher excitation inhibition balance. So kind of our neurons just kind of fire more and are more easy to like make them start firing. Also, and perhaps going along with that, a lot more plasticity. So they seem to kind of strengthen and weaken synapses faster. And then the third one seems to be this kind of connectivity thing. So kind of that pattern of I mentioned where it seems like for some reason like our the actual structures between neurons, the structure of the connectivity can be very different. And it might be this thing where you have a lot more connectivity between neurons that are like close to each other in the same brain region, and then less connectivity between neurons like that are far away from each other. And I think all of those are like I think it's really interesting that we're getting to the point where we're starting to be able to think about like, okay, what are these phenotypes? Because I think that can just tell us a lot about how people process information in general. And we were asking about like, oh, why is this group of people more creative? Or why is this group of people really good at this task or really bad at this task? I think it's really cool when you can like relate it to these things. Like, what is this like network structure of how these neurons
structure function, like a direct connection
yeah.
between a structure and function, which is like that's like the point of biology, right? Like
Yeah.
we want to figure out how things work. Um yeah, and like those same things that make them different and special is also like what makes them special too. And a good like it's like a useful I was gonna say double-edged sword, but that sounds like a bad thing. Like
I mean, I think it is. I mean, I think like I think like when I was reading some of these like when I was reading some of these books about like or some of these papers about like evolution and autism, that seems to be like one of the common theories is that it works a little bit like kind of like the same reason that we have sickle cell disease, which is a lot of these genes that cause autism, they're really, like you said, they don't just cause autism. They're actually kind of genes that they seem to be genes that are involved in like brain development and learning and memory that like occasionally also cause autism. And it seems like we actually picked up these specific variants of these genes because they had benefits for us in helping improve our memory and cognitive function. And sometimes they also cause some bad things too.
yeah. Yeah, and you can see that, right? Like I think one of the biggest I guess like the seeable advantages or negative is like this hyper focusing and attentions to detail and like ability to like remember a lot of really really detailed things.
Yeah. I
It
mean,
could
and
be
I'll say
really
that
beneficial
also,
in
yeah.
society.
And I
And
think
being
also
super
there's
creative, right? Go ahead.
benefits to people who like have some autism genes but don't necessarily like aren't necessarily autistic too. I think, and
Yeah.
that's kind of when people are talking about this, I think that's actually where the theory about where a lot of this selective advantage is coming from.
Yeah. The selective advantage, if we go back to that graph, is for all the people that are not on that tail, but are like close to
Mhm.
that line, right? Close to that dotted
Yeah.
line where
Yeah.
they were like diagnosed, is not the right word, it's not a disease, like, or like true synesthetes, but actually all the people that are close to that line or just to the left of that line, that huge under the curve, all those humans, they're benefiting from it, right? Like they have the advantage of being very good at identifying colors and numbers like in 5 days. Like I could ask you 5 months from now and you could be like, yeah, that color is green. Like that is so
Yeah.
impressive.
Yeah.
Just like just the task itself. It's just like I'm gonna give you a bunch of random sounds and then you tell me the color. And then next week I'm gonna give you the same random sounds but in different order, but now tell me what color those meant last time. And like all those people that were really close to the line did really amazingly well, like well above chance. Um at this like super hard task.
I mean, it is evolutionarily, it is there's a few missing pieces. It's like identify colors well, question mark, lots of children.
That's true.
But
I
yeah, it
always
is.
wonder if like these memory like let's say letter to color synesthetes like really depends on how they were taught the numbers and letters when they were kids. Like maybe when they were learning the alphabet, they were using an alphabet book, or like there's like alphabet blocks, and then like the letter A is red and the letter B is orange. And then for them, A is always red. Do you know what I mean? Like, and then it's just like stuck. And forever the letter A
Mhm.
is red. And like you don't even remember it because you were exposed to these like blocks when they were like 3 or pre-3. I don't know when you learn letters. Um and then it's just stuck like that. Like for your whole life. And
Yeah,
just like with
I've
memory.
definitely heard people like speculate about that, and it's like, okay, if you have if you have this kind of underlying propensity, like, and then you just have an experience like that, maybe that's why you get that.
Yeah. Or like, the days of the week have personalities. I was just like, wait, what? Your days and weeks have personalities? And then I was like, well, I guess if you have a lot of great Fridays, then Fridays is always like a party day. And then like Mondays are blue or sad. And it's like, well, yeah, you got to go back to work. You just had a weekend. Do you know what I mean? Like maybe that's, or you had to go to school
Maybe
and
that's how
you
they
didn't.
do that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Then that's how they like, pick up the personalities along the way, and they like made so many of those associations throughout their lives, like, and it's
Because it's like it's how people are acting on those days. So yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
I think the personalities with tied to time and dates, and also like the spatial ones, the spatial numbers and times, like those makes like those are really high, right? Like those are up to 20% of the population. I was just like, that's just because we learned how to read clocks. Like numbers
Mhm.
have orientations because like we learned how to read like an
Because they
analog
have a
clock as a
present. Yeah.
child. Yeah, and so like 3 is obviously right and 9 is obviously left, right? Like, does that make it, synesthesia or just a mnemonic? Um,
Yeah.
anyway, I thought it
Anyway,
was a
yeah, I
cool way to
think
study and also celebrate neurodiversity. Um, or
yeah,
yeah,
yay.
or be
I
aware of
feel
neurodiversity.
like it's a fitting topic for a stream where we just kind of like have 2 to 3 people intro dump at each other for an hour. Like,
I like info dumping. That was our
yeah,
that was our goal. And
yeah,
also like it lets you read some stuff that you wouldn't have
true.
read and
Uh-huh.
known the exact numbers for.
Uh-huh. Yeah, honestly, I I was going to talk more about autism brain physiology, and then like I started reading about it, and I was like, well, actually, no one really knows what's going on. Like they like so many papers are like, oh, it's because we have more neurons, or maybe less neurons, or also maybe the same number of neurons but in different parts of the brain.
Uh
Like, it
yeah.
was like, okay,
No, and that's also
cool.
why we know we have so much to talk about. Like we will never run
Yeah,
out of
yeah.
topics for the stream. As always, thank you for joining us. We're Philosophisciencing. If you're interested in a specific topic and you want us to cover, please feel free to DM us, or drop things in the chat in future. See you guys next week.
Bye.